Hello and welcome back to another episode of The Poetics of. So today I thought it would be fun to take a look at John Mayer and specifically look at his lyrics for The Queen of California. If I can, let you all in on a little secret, I think it would be fun to eventually cover all of the tracks from the album Born and Raised. I probably won't be able to do those, in order in terms of episode upload, but every once in a while I'd like to return to this album until we've covered all of them, because I really believe that every track on this album is doing something really interesting, and it shows some of John's strongest lyrics. For any of you who are new to this channel, basically what we do here is we take a look at a piece of media that is not explicitly being presented as a poem and sort of analyze it like it's a poem. So it's a lyric analysis, but rather than trying to look into subliminals or direct allusions by the author, it's more of a matter of looking at the poem as it is, and so taking a look at the different poetic devices, metaphor, simile, rhyme scheme, meter, etc., and more trying to see what we can learn from the poem itself rather than trying to deep dive through interviews or something like that. It's a great exercise for learning the process of doing a close reading, so you can apply this to real poems and other pieces of media yourself. But it's also a great opportunity for learning more about the writing process itself, because we're essentially getting to study the masters and see what they're doing. And even if some of these cool things are ultimately unintentional, it's cool to learn what they're playing with and see how you can apply it to your own writing. Only other thing I always like to mention at the start of these is this channel is a big believer in the concept of the death of the author, which basically means once a piece of media is distributed out to the audience, any interpretation by the audience is ultimately valid, and we don't have to only look at what the author's intent was, especially in the context of something like this video where we're just doing a close reading. Everyone comes to a piece of media with a different perspective based on their own world experiences and their outlooks on the world, their own morals, etc. So today's just going to be my interpretation. So as a result, I'd love to hear in the comments what your interpretation is, if you agree with what I'm saying, if you disagree, if you got a totally different interpretation or different meaning out of it, etc. I always think it's really fun to go through those and see what other people are getting out of these pieces of media. So seriously, I'd love to see that in the comments. And if you want to join the community and enroll in our little class here, it would mean a lot if you could subscribe. It just helps grow the channel, get us out there more, and which basically just means we get to have more fun and more conversations in the comments and more discussion, etc. So without any further ado, let's jump right into the first verse. All right, and so here we have our first verse, and the equivalent of a verse in poetry is a stanza. Stanza is sort of also like an equivalent of a paragraph if it was a longer form of writing like a novel or a short story, but it's basically the division of sections of writing, how they're broken up, just like how verses are. So first thing I always like to take a look at is some of the rhymes that might be going on and some of the different sounds that are being played with. So here we have rain and same. Now these are not exact rhymes, but instead they're near rhymes. And so basically what that means is they are using a similar sound in the middle of them, but the whole word together doesn't perfectly rhyme with each other. So it's not red and bed, it's rain and shame, but you get that aim, shame sound in both of them. You also get sort of a perfect exact rhyme here in that they are the same word being used. Goodbye, 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 goodbye. And so that creates sort of a cyclical a series of phrases that then are getting played with. So we get goodbye this, goodbye that, goodbye this, goodbye that, and kind of creates like its own sort of internal section. Then we get on, which doesn't really rhyme, obviously, with rain or shame, but it also doesn't rhyme with soul and knows, so it's sort of its own thing. Now, soul and know, they don't rhyme when I'm saying them out loud like that, but sort of in the performance, they're a bit more similar in that they both have that O sound, so it's more of a no and a soul, so it's sort of in that sense, it's sort of delivered. So once again, sort of a near rhyme. Now, as for meter, usually we don't find perfect meter in songs except for, some of the Irish folk songs we've taken a look at and more like traditional songs. So, or at least I should say, we don't find a consistent meter that is mirrored line after line after line. That being said, it's always sort of fun to take a look at some of the areas where there's stress and unstress. So we sort of get a kind of a pretty strong goodbye cold, goodbye rain, which could be a goodbye cold, goodbye rain sort of thing. Goodbye sorrow, goodbye shame. That being said, it's all pretty stressed to my ear anyway, and it's sort of interesting too, is this is the opening of the poem. It's sort of an invocation, and we're getting immediately that this is a character for the song or the poem who's sort of the narrator who's speaking this line. They are sort of they're telling us by having this long series of things to say goodbye to that they're revealing that they've been in a state which has all of these things. If you were in a really good state and things were going really well for you, and the only problem you had was a stubbed toe, let's say, then if you were to be trying to say that you were moving on from that chapter in your life, you would only have to be able to say, well, goodbye pain in my toe that I stubbed, because everything else is fine. But this speaker, is from a state that has cold, rain, sorrow, and shame. And shame is an interesting use or a word choice. So as we've said before with pieces of poetry, and we also see this with songwriting, every word counts and matters, and they matter a lot more than you would see in, for example, a long novel. And that's because since you only have so many words that you get to play with and use, they have to be perfect. They have to be the best word choice and which conveys the best amount of meaning, the most amount of meaning, etc. Or else you risk essentially, like having a watered down statement and your theme won't come across, etc. So shame is an interesting choice here because shame can imply a degree of guilt. Now, you can either feel shame because of genuine guilt, or people can place guilt onto you and then still make you feel shame, or they feel that you should feel shame, and you might not actually be to blame. It's if you're falsely accused for something, you might still weirdly start to feel ashamed just based on the fact that everyone's treating you like you did something wrong. Or if you did something wrong, you're going to feel a sense of shame. But so there seems to be some sort of narrative of wrongdoing. Now, it's not clear whether it is, if this is true or false, but within the narrative, it's a plot point. Something was done where this narrator feels shame, or at least is having shame placed onto them. We don't know yet. But they're now heading out west with their headphones on. They've boarded a flight with a song in the back of my soul, and no one knows. So here we get a sense of, solitude, sort of an individual and an individualistic spirit, in that by putting on these headphones, they're blocking out other people and other things around them. So they're going on this flight, which, so they are actually going on a physical journey and an emotional one. So this isn't them just still staying in their apartment, but they're trying to get character growth or something like this. This is them actually being able to say that they are also literally leaving this place where there's the cold and the rain. And which is also interesting in that their opening line, cold can be taken two ways, where, you could say someone is emotionally cold to you and, they're not being warm and inviting, etc. But, it also is a literal physical temperature. And we also get rain, which is much more of a temperature thing. However, we also tend to associate rain with things like sorrow and occasionally shame, in that it can usually sort of be reflective of tears and crying. But since this is also physical, it goes right into the whole fact that this character / narrator is literally physically boarding a flight. They have a song in the back of their soul that no one knows. It's interesting that it's "and no one knows" instead of "that no one knows," because the use of "and" here instead of, because if you were to say that, you would say, "I'm boarding a flight with a song in the back of my soul that no one knows," which I thought initially on a read was saying that the thing that no one knows is the song in the back of their soul. And I thought it was sort of like a romanticism, sort of sentiment of, I have, I'm marching to the beat of my own drum. I've got my own song. I'm an individual, and sort of like, not being oppressive, etc. So, but with the "and" here, it almost makes it seem more like they're heading out west. They've boarded a flight and no one knows. So is it just that no one knows that they're leaving this state of cold, rain, sorrow, shame? And, they're clearly somewhere in the east, or east of something. It doesn't mean they're in the east in terms of how we would think of that. We would think of that as being, since this is an American song, you would think maybe east of America, Europe, Japan, Asia, etc. Instead, they're west of something, and also there's sort of the whole American mythos of the sort of more legendary spiritual West, the great frontier, manifest destiny, and that sort of cowboy aesthetic of riding off, into the West, into the sunset, etc. But again, I think actually what's being said here is that no one is aware that this character is going on this journey, which does still fit into the whole, it's their solitude, it's a solitary journey, it's an individual journey, an individualistic journey. They're doing it without any partners, without any co-conspirators, etc. They're heading out all by themselves. And the headphones and the song, I think will show up more later, of that music is a very important part of this person's journey and their sort of sense of self and their soul, etc. Let's see if there's anything else we should be dissecting here, or we can move on to the next part. I guess I just want to, one more time, since I believe this will become relevant later, I want to re-emphasize that there's something interesting going on with this repetition of goodbyes and how it begins with the naturalistic and then goes to the emotional. So with that, let's jump into the next passage. Now, if you guys can give me sort of I don't know, basically trust me, I'm going somewhere with this, trust the process. I want to take a quick look at William Wordsworth's the Prelude. Now, small tangent, but there is an 1805 version and I believe it's an 1850 version. I highly recommend that all of my students check out the 1805 version. It's William Wordsworth wrote this one when he was much more romantic in sentiment, and he grew much more conservative and sort of bitter and sort of shaken by like the French Revolution and all sorts of stuff in the 1805 one or the 1850 one. So I feel like a lot of the charm and the magic has been removed from the 1805 one in the 1850, but okay, anyway, tangent aside, the Prelude. Book 1 opens with a passage that you can see on the chalkboard right here. And if you'll give me a moment, I want to do a very short reading of it, very quick, because I believe that what Wordsworth is playing with in this opening to his poem is very similar to what John Mayer is doing in Queen of California. So it goes, "Oh, there is a blessing in this gentle breeze, a visitant that while it fans my cheek doth seem half conscious of the joy it brings from the green fields and from yon azure sky. Whate'er its mission, the soft breeze can come to none more grateful than to me, escaped from the vast city where I long had pined a discontented sojourner, now free, free as a bird to settle where I will. What dwelling shall receive me, and what vale shall be my harbor? Underneath what grove shall I take up my home? And what clear stream shall with its murmur lull me into rest? The earth is all before me. With a heart joyous, not scared at its own liberty, I look about, and should the chosen guide be nothing better than a wandering cloud, I cannot miss my way. I breathe again. Trances of thoughts and mountings of the mind come fast upon me. It is shaken off, that burthen of my own unnatural self, the heavy weight of many a weary day not mine, and such as were not made for me. Long months of peace, if such bold word accord with any promises of human life, long months of ease and undisturbed delight are mine in prospect. Whither shall I turn, by road or pathway, or through trackless field, up hill or down, or shall some floating thing upon the river point me out my course?" So here, as you can see, this is the opening of Wordsworth's great epic, which is about sort of the formation of the poetic mind and basically his journey into becoming a poet. And he doesn't just mean like being someone who writes poems, but someone who thinks like a poet and holds a true poet's like philosophy in their heart. And so just like any other epic poem that had come before Wordsworth, whether that be Milton or whether that be, Homer, Virgil, etc., these poets always begin their epic poems with a great sort of invocation, and usually it's an invocation of the muses, but here Wordsworth is sort of doing an invocation of nature itself, in that he's calling upon nature to be the muse that guides his way. However, he both is saying, that he wants this nature, this breeze, this cloud, etc., to sort of be his chosen guide. And he doesn't just mean in the telling of this poem, but also literally in his own physical journey. So here we see that he has left London, and I believe it's London, it might be France. He traveled to a lot of different cities, and then he had a very long period of time in which he stayed up in the Lake District, Dove Cottage, etc. But the point being is that he had been in the city, and the city had caused him a great degree of sort of grief. It stressed him out. There was all the cacophony of sounds, and it was stressful and overstimulating, but also there was a degree of corruption and crime and harshness and sort of seeing human suffering, etc. And he just felt that it was a bad influence on himself, which is also sort of, he was channeling the whole industrial revolution and, nature versus, the industrial revolution, and sort of that sentiment of like nature versus machine, etc. But here, so he says, there's a blessing in this gentle breeze. It's a visitant that fans his cheek, and it's almost as if the breeze is half conscious of the joy that it brings to him from the green fields and from the sky. But regardless of its mission, it can come to none more grateful than him, who has just escaped from the vast city, where he had long been behind a discontented sojourner. He's traveling about, he's discontented, but now he is free as a bird to settle where he will, because he's out in nature. He's gone up north to the Lake District. But so, what dwelling shall receive him? Where is he going to live? What vale is going to be the harbor for him, as sort of a harbor being a safe space for ships to go when there's storms and all that. Under what grove is he going to take up his home, and what stream is going to lull him to rest with its sort of natural music. And basically the earth is all before him. And so, he has a heart that is joyous, and it's not scared at its own liberty. He looks about himself, and even if his chosen guide should be nothing more than a wandering cloud, and he'll literally follow the cloud, he cannot miss his way. He breathes again. And, it is shaking off this burden of his own unnatural self that he had in the city, the heavy weight of a many a weary day, not his, not how he wanted to live, not his choice of how to live. And they were not made for him. Long months of peace, if such a bold word accord with any promises of human life, long months of ease and undisturbed delight are mine and prospect. So he's hoping that in the future he's going to have long months of peace, because he has not been having those. And so, wherever he turns, wherever he goes, what is going to point him on his course and lead him to these long months of peace and joy and, true pastoral bliss. So, if you look at all that, and then we minimize all this, and we go back to the Queen of California, we see a very similar thing in which John is saying goodbye to the cold, goodbye to the rain, goodbye to the sorrow, goodbye to the shame of the cities. And if I'm trying to do a bit of a meta read, I know that at this time, John had been spending time in New York, which is basically like, not to diss New York, but I feel like New York is sort of the romantic poet's antithesis. So he's heading out west from the East Coast. He has his headphones on, he's boarding a flight, and he has a song in the back of his soul. And it almost feels like that song is sort of guiding him in the same way that the gentle breeze had a song and was guiding Wordsworth. So yeah, I just wanted to take a moment and sort of draw a connection of these two parallels and see how this relatively modern song is having a conversation with the poets of the 19th century. And whether John intended this or not, it just doesn't really matter, because the influence of those who came before us is so pervasive that it's pretty hard to basically even claim to not be influenced by, especially the Romantic period. So much of our modern society is basically informed by Romanticism, whether we know it or not. So, if John were to see this and say, oh, I've never read Wordsworth, or, I find Wordsworth boring or something like that, I would still say that basically he unintentionally is having a conversation with that poem. So now we can actually jump into the next passage. All right, and now we have sort of a shorter motif that we'll see throughout the song. However, I think there's something really interesting going on here, and that's why I wanted to just leave just this up on the board so we could focus on it in particular. Before I get into that, just to point it out, we've got a rhyme, town, down, we got an actual exact rhyme there. And let's look at the meter. So it's sort of, I just found out her ghost left town. The Queen of California is stepping down, down. The down, down creates kind of an interesting little meter here with going off of this double bounce here of unstressed. Then we get the stressed. But anyway, So at that point, it's almost a bit of a tangent. What's interesting is we get this narrative of this, the narrator / protagonist is leaving a place of coldness and shame. They are heading west, and then they note that they just found out her ghost left town. Well, what town? The Queen of California, California being a western place, is stepping down. Now, what's really interesting about this is this, to me, actually reveals a little bit more about our narrator and sort of potentially what sort of story is being told here. So if we had a narrator who was over here in the east, and it's a place of shame, and then we have our place over here in the west, and it's, basically it's being told to us that's California, and that it has a queen, and that our protagonist has been staying here in this place of shame until they found out that her ghost left town and that she is stepping down, and now he's able to head out west and no one knows he's doing it. I would argue that actually tells us that he is, in a way, sort of an exile, and that he was sort of exiled by the queen and thus was forced to go east. Like, he used to live in the realm of the Queen of California, and that might be where he is naturally from. Then he was exiled, and then it wasn't until the queen stepped down that he was able to return. It also seems to tell us that, to a degree, the narrator / protagonist may believe that they were unjustly exiled, because basically as soon as that authoritative figure leaves and quote unquote steps down, he's able to return back to the realm, which, if he felt genuine shame and guilt at whatever caused him to have to leave, you would think that would continue to be enacted after the queen stepped down, if he was in that sense honorable. But if it was sort of a false accusation or a false hostility that caused this exile, even if it was a self-induced exile in order to get away from the Queen of California, once she steps down, he's able to return, which tells us again a lot about this narrator's sort of perspective on the whole situation. It's also interesting because stepping down, the use of this sort of word choice here, normally someone steps down after they sort of have their own wrongdoing. Occasionally we see someone stepping down due to old age, but it's sort of a voluntarily quitting or retiring. But usually we see this in situations of wrongdoing, in that, normally if the leader of a company, if that company started doing something really bad and people found out and got mad at that company, normally we see the CEO or someone like that step down. So that's interesting. It's also interesting, though, that it might have just been the ghost of this Queen of California that was lingering in the West, which almost we could interpret that as saying, so basically there was the main character in the West, suddenly this queen figure shows up, he leaves, whether he's kicked out or leaves, we don't know, it could be a self-exile. The queen then leaves this area, goes somewhere else, and so it's the ghost of her that remains. But when she steps down from this other area, it basically washes the slate clean in the other areas. I think that's pretty interesting. I feel like there actually is a lot of, it's only a couple words, but it actually kind of reveals a lot to us, or at least my interpretation of sort of the narrative here. The only other thing I want to mention is that since it's the Queen of California, there's sort of something interesting going on here in that if you think about it, okay, so he's using medieval imagery or like old political imagery in this song, which is an Americana song, which is sort of interesting because we don't normally see talk of kings and queens nearly as much. I mean, obviously Bob Dylan uses it, but usual like folk Americana, because America doesn't have monarchs, etc., doesn't show up as much. But here it's interesting because if you were to say, well, the Queen of California and he's exiled, peasants, for example, commoners, low-ranking artisans, etc., they don't tend to get exiled. They don't tend to be in such a situation that they have to leave a place if they get on the wrong side of the queen and then they can come back. It's normally some level of nobility that has to be exiled, because there's sort of like implies a certain level of like maybe they had some degree of ownership over this territory. The queen showed up and then they had to leave, etc. I think there's sort of an interesting, if you look at that relationship between the Queen of California and our narrator protagonist, it implies that the narrator protagonist isn't just a nobody, because also they clearly got on the sort of target list of this Queen of California, had to leave, and again, them being able to leave, if we're playing with the medieval imagery, implies maybe they were a bit more high ranked as well. But just wanted to go into that theory here, and let's jump into the next part. All right, so speaking of exiles and lords, I thought it would be fun to talk for a moment about Lord Byron. So Lord Byron is a 19th century poet who actually was a lord, and is one of the main contributors to the English Romantic period, especially that sort of second generation. So the first generation was Wordsworth, Coleridge, and a few others, which we just took a look at. And then the second generation was like Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, John Keats, etc. They're sort of the younger ones, but tragically, none of them really made it past, I think Lord Byron only made it to be 30-something. But the point being is Lord Byron himself, in real life, kind of had to do a self-exile in which he left England and went out and traveled the world and stuff, because he had gotten into some sort of societal issues and sort of gossip and drama was surrounding him and his name. So he left England, but it was a self-imposed exile, technically. But he wrote a piece called sort of an epic poem, since we're looking at epic poems today, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Now, child in this context actually means a young noble. It's not child in the sense that we think of it. It's sort of like a archaic term for knight. Harold is sort of like a stand-in character for Lord Byron. Basically, in the earlier parts of the poem, he tries to really be like, oh no, this is a fictional character I'm writing about, but by the third book, he basically just fully admits that it's autobiographical. Pilgrimage is sort of his journey through his self-exile. So here's two passages from the first book of that I just want to do a quick reading of and take a look at, just since we're discussing these themes of nobility and exiles and romanticism, etc. So the first passage goes, the child departed from his father's hall. It was a vast and venerable pile, so old it seemed not only to fall, yet strength was pillared in each massy aisle. Monastic dome, condemned to uses vile, where superstition once had made her den, now Paphian girls were known to sing and smile, and monks might deem their time had come again, if ancient tales say true, nor wrong these holy men. And then later, so that's during the passage where he's actually leaving his childhood home, and so basically his father's hall, which he had just inherited, but it's ruined and dilapidated and stuff like that. Then he gets on his ship, and they set sail, and they finally actually leave. And so he says, "Adieu, adieu, my native shore, fades o'er the waters blue. The night winds sigh, the breakers roar, and shrieks the wild sea mew. Yon sun that sets upon the sea, we follow in his flight. Farewell a while to him and thee, my native land, good night." So, basically just wanted to point out the parallels between these, but if we were to use our imagination a bit and almost insert a bit of a narrative to the Queen of California, it almost feels a little bit like part of the Queen of California occurs, in media res, which basically means it takes place in the middle of the story, like usually at a climactic moment, in that we didn't get to see this character when he lived in the West already. We didn't get to see him leave due to his exile, but we didn't really get to see much of the portion of the story with the Queen. But instead, we get to join the story once the Queen has already stepped down, and now he's heading out west. So one has to imagine, though, what was going on during this whole time and this whole time. And that Lord Byron passage that began with the adieu, adieu, you can almost imagine that is almost what's going on in this character's head. Similar sentiment, not this exact lines, because this is a very archaic style of language, but it almost feels like this person, when the Queen of California exiled them, they might have had a similar sentiment. So anyway, mostly just wanted to point out this cool parallel. Onwards to the next portion. All right, and now we have our second verse. And this one begins with a really interesting mirroring of the first verse, in which it goes, hello, 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 while that first verse said, goodbye cold, goodbye shame, goodbye rain, etc. Here we also start with some natural words, and then we end on an emotional word. So we get beauty, strange, and wonder. Now, what's interesting about these last two word choices here is the one thing that sort of throws a wrench in some of the theories we had discussed earlier about this whole exile plot is that it seems to be that where he's going as he travels west is strange and wondrous and, new to him. Which makes me think that, I don't think we were far off, though. I think the main difference might be that it might have been that, the West is sort of a natural home to our protagonist, but the Queen of California was sort of blocking him off of ever getting to travel there. And so he might have always lived in the sense of cold and shame, etc. But now that she's stepped down, this barrier is no longer there, and he can now finally explore this beautiful, strange, and wondrous place. Also, what's your name? It's sort of he's being introduced to it. That being said, what's your name? Also with beauty and strange and wonder. In a way, he almost could be speaking to a person. He could be either personifying the West, and when you personify something, you're sort of taking something that isn't animate or isn't actually a human, and you're adding human characteristics to it and sort of projecting that onto them, or you're just treating it like it's a person. So here he may be personifying the West into this person that he's asking, what's your name? He can't literally talk to the West in that sense. Or this might be showing that now that he's gone west, he's starting to meet new people. Now, after the gold rush, that's a reference to Neil Young. So he's looking for the sun that Neil Young hung, which basically what he's really just saying here is that he is sort of trying to find the sort of muse and sort of vibe. You can't see me right now on the chalkboard. Here I wrote muse and vibe that previous musical artists who did this sort of folk Americana stuff, like Neil Young, who did Harvest, After the Gold Rush, Harvest Moon, etc. They were doing that, and so he's hoping to sort of channel that sort of sun and that sort of vibe. And we'll see the sentiment being repeated later on in the passage as well. There isn't really a rhyme scheme here again. We have strange and name, so that A sound sort of harmonizes, and hung and one, kind of that un sound, those sort of harmonize with the one of 1971. But here we just have only near rhymes. And what's also interesting that I want to point out while we're in this passage is in the first verse he says goodbye 4 times. He says goodbye, 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 and then there's another goodbye here. Here, however, he says hello, hello, hello only 3 times. Now, and then he changes the flow state, and instead of saying hello to something else, he says, what's your name? And I think that's really interesting because when he said goodbye 4 times, it actually created sort of a lock on this opening 2 lines in which, those were all neatly tied together with that sort of repeating, goodbye, 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 goodbye. By not doing that here and by breaking the chain now only lasts this long, and the second line then continues on in a new direction, which sort of reflects his own sense of he's in the process of entering this new West, entering this new state of his life where he's seeing things, meeting new things, meeting strange things, meeting wondrous new things, and exploring. And so as a result, he doesn't chain and lock up this portion. So I find that to be extremely interesting, and it's something we can apply to our own writing. All right, onward to the next part. All right, and here we have the final passage that we're going to be taking a look at. So you probably recognize these 2 portions because those are, sort of just the repeated motif, refrain that is being said throughout the song, something you see in a lot of songs. But also, repetition is always important to acknowledge in poetry and writing, because while with songs it's very standard to go back to a refrain, I feel like since it's so standard in this sort of songwriting we see these days, it can be easy to sort of gloss over the value that you get from that refrain, and that repeating something and drawing your attention to it and emphasizing it through repetition, it usually means there's something really important there, and it's something that's very important to the narrator, the protagonist, the sort of POV of the piece of writing. So, for example, here, the Queen of California, since this is being mentioned and this passage is being placed between those 2, we can assume that the her here is the Queen of California. Same with the her here, we can assume that this is the same her. So, her ghost left town. If you see her, say hello. Before we get into that, though, let's do what we always do and take a quick look at the rhyme scheme. So we have an actual exact rhyme here with hello and so. And then we have see, me, and free, which these are all exact rhymes of each other, which gives us an A, B, B, B rhyme scheme. And if you aren't familiar with using letters like this, it's basically just something we do with poetry to notate different rhyme schemes, because some rhyme or some poetic structures have very set rhyme schemes. So, a Shakespearean sonnet has a bunch of quatrains which will go like A, B, and then the next one would be C, D, C, D. The next one is E, F, and then it ends on a couplet, which rhymes with itself, so it's just a GG. So by writing these letters down when we see a passage that rhymes, it can help us and make it easier to identify whether this is an actual, well-known poetic structure. Not that I was expecting to find a sonnet in this song, for example. But hypothetically, if there was a song and you were noticing that it had a set rhyme scheme and you went through and you realized the song was only 14 lines and that it followed a rhyme scheme like this is a Shakespearean rhyme scheme, also sometimes referred to as an Elizabethan rhyme scheme, but there's also Miltonic sonnets, there's also Petrarchan and Spenserian, and they all have different rhyme schemes. But it's not impossible for there to be a song that is actually written lyrically like a sonnet. I would guess that would be intentional, so it can be cool to be able to identify that. But just wanted to explain that in case this is your first time stopping by our channel. But I also want to note that since this is sort of the one passage that really brings out this rhyme scheme, it draws your attention into this part. I feel like this is one of the parts that I tend to remember from the song the most, because that rhyme scheme makes it easier to remember the passage as well. That's sort of why a lot of Shakespeare rhymes and uses the same meter and rhyme scheme, is because it helps the actual actors remember their lines. And so I think that here we're going to be getting some of the most important information we can get from the whole song. So let's take a look at that directly now. All right, I'm just gonna erase my chalk there so we can see the text a bit better and a bit more clearer. So he says, if you see her, and again, we're proposing that the her here is the Queen of California, whose ghost has now left town, say hello. Just don't tell me I told you so. So the first part tells us that there is some level of, familiarity between our narrator and the queen, we'll call her, because it's sort of like he's someone from her past, so he's saying to someone else who we don't know who this you is, which is interesting. The you could be us, the listening audience, or he could be speaking to someone directly here, but we don't know who that is. But it's someone, the you is someone who might see the queen, because the narrator would not be saying this to someone who wouldn't ever bump into the queen. You wouldn't say, oh, when you meet William Shakespeare, tell him I said hi, because it's impossible for you to meet William Shakespeare. So here he's clearly familiar. It's almost like a friend of a friend situation. This you might be friends with the narrator and be friends with the queen, and they're sort of awkwardly in between them. And so the narrator is actually trying to keep things somewhat amiable between himself and the queen, where it's basically like, hello, mutual friend, if you happen to see the queen, tell her I said hi. I'm not going to tell her directly because things are too awkward or difficult between us, whatever the sort of barrier is between these two characters. But there is a barrier which is stopping him from directly addressing the queen, but he still wants a mutual friend to express hello. This next line's really confusing to me, though. And I'm not sure I have a clear understanding of what it really means. Just don't tell me I told you so. The only thing I can guess here is, so again, who's going to be telling him something? It's going to be this you, not the Queen of California. So you here, the narrator saying, tell her hi if you see her, but don't tell me I told you so. Now, that I told you so could mean a couple things. It could either mean the you basically told the narrator, maybe like you'll miss her and want to say hi, or the you is sort of saying, something along the lines of like, sure, I'll say hi, but she's going to say something mean in return. And then the narrator's like, well, do it anyway, just in case. So then the you goes to the queen, says, hey, narrator says hi. And then the queen says, I'm not saying hi back. Whatever. I don't want to be too presumptuous here. So let's just say she says, well, I don't say hi back. And then you would then be going back to the narrator and saying, I told you she wouldn't say hi back. That kind of thing. You can understand the sentiment I'm getting at here. That's my only real guess here. Or, like I said, it's maybe like this is him sort of being like, I kind of want to reach out to like maybe an ex, if it's like a weird love song or something like that. Or not a love song, but you get what I mean. If he's discussing some sort of broken up relationship with an ex, and then they have a mutual friend, and the friend's like, oh, you're gonna want to get back with her, blah blah blah. And then here he's accidentally sort of slipping up, and he's like, hey, well, I mean, if you see her, say hello. And then the friend's like, bro, I told you you would be like that. Do you see that sort of sentiment? Those are sort of the only real understandings I can guess, but I'm not confident that I'm 100% reading that line correctly. I've always thought that was sort of an interesting line, in that I haven't always fully gotten a good read on it. And then here we get another reference to another major writer, which is Joni Mitchell, who wrote Blue, major album, just like Neil Young. So here the narrator is clearly channeling a bunch of, sort of like Americana / folk greats and legends. And here's something interesting happens though. In the previous passage, the verse 2, he says that he's looking for the sun that Neil Young hung after the gold rush of 1971. Here, however, he's looking for another color. So he's not actually looking for blue, which goes back to what we were seeing in the very first passage, which is that he has the heart of an individual. He doesn't just want to repeat what Joni Mitchell did. He wants to get his own color. He's not going to try to just repeat blue. But there's sort of also a level of like hopeful, sort of like hopeful, I don't want to say almost like hopeful desperation, in that he's got to believe that there's another color waiting on him to set him free. But since there's sort of this like, I gotta believe, there's sort of like a sense of like he's been trying to find this other color, he's been struggling to do so, but he has to believe in it because it's his ticket to being set free. So he's been struggling to find that other color, but he hasn't given up yet. And it's through music here then, if blue is music and Young's sun and all of that is an allusion to music, and he has a song in the back of his soul that he's getting on the plane with his headphones on, music is what's going to set him free. So ultimately, if he's being set free, well, from what? And it seems like he's being set free from his shame. And his shame may be connected to the Queen of California. So basically we get this narrative of, where can I write this? The Queen equals shame. Then the Queen stepped down. So she's gone. So now there is an opportunity to get rid of the shame. But in order to do that, he's going to need music. Music will set him free from the shame of what he's related, or the shame that's related to the Queen of California. So, yeah, I think that's pretty much the thesis of the song. The song is about going on a personal journey. It is about, both leaving your past, though maybe also returning to confront your past. And it is about, self-imposed exilement, and how music, from this narrator's perspective, is what will set him free. And, similarly to what we're doing, where here John Mayer has music. William Wordsworth, in that passage we looked at before, had poetry. He had poetry, and so therefore poetry is being compared to music, which is very much what we're doing here on this channel, where we are looking at songwriting and lyrics and seeing the poetry within them. So I think that's really cool. All right, so now that we have all of our chalkboards sort of lined up, we can see just how much crazy writing we were doing on this little annotation exercise. But I think that's going to wrap this up. I think it's sort of a nice note to end on, seeing that the theme of this song is that music and writing may set you free. And, you know, sometimes you may not find it right away, but it's important to believe that inspiration and your muses and your next great piece of art is still out there, and sometimes you just need to go on a journey to find it. And sometimes on that journey you have to basically leave behind a lot of your own maybe emotional turmoil or burdens. So, you know, that cold and that rain and that sorrow and that shame, sometimes you have to leave those behind in pursuit of your art. So yeah, I had a lot of fun with this. I hope you guys did too. Like I said, I'd love to take a look at more of John Mayer's writing, especially from his Born and Raised era, but also there's so many good songs in his discography, especially lyrically, like Stop This Train from Continuum or Slow Dancing in a Burning Room. And Sob Rock also has some really good songs on it, like It Doesn't Matter But It Should. And even Wild Blue's pretty interesting, and I kind of want to take a look at that one. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you did, and if you haven't yet, it would mean so much if you could subscribe, sort of join our community here, because I truly believe that this sort of exercise of lyrical analysis and interpretation and close reading benefits from true discourse and discussion. And so I'd love to see in the comments if you guys could give me your thoughts on the song. You know, did you get a totally different interpretation of this from me? Or do you agree with me? Do you think, you know, I nailed it? I'd love to hear it. So yeah. But with that, I think I'm going to wrap this up. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in our next close reading.